Greetings, drowsy spirit. Tonight, I will be your storyteller, assisting you in falling asleep soundly and deeply. Remember to subscribe and like the video before we start for more bedtime stories. Tell me where you are watching and what time it is in the comments. I would also love to know what story you would want to hear next. Bills don't give a damn about your sleep schedule, but I've never loved working at night. I wanted something reliable and distracting after my divorce in 2018. That's how I managed to run the graveyard shift at a petrol station outside of New Hanover, Maine, off Route 16. It was one of those isolated locations where truckers pulled over for coffee and weary travelers inquired for directions that they had already missed 10 miles before. Every few seconds, the sign in front blinked. All I could hear inside was the old ceiling fan's gentle drone and a row of humming refrigerators. I worked 5 evenings a week from 1000 p.m. to 6 a.m. mostly tranquil hours, but occasionally to quiet. It was on a Thursday in late October that I first realized something wasn't right. It's the kind of night when the highway is heavily obscured by fog and even your headlights appear too worn out to shine through it. Backstory: the burden of quiet. I had worked as a Portland warehouse photographer before to that position. I would go out and take pictures of abandoned buildings for inventory records, old mills, offices, and locations that smelled like rust and time. Back then, I enjoyed the quiet. Control came from silence. That same stillness grew intolerable after the divorce. It was heavy. The home seemed to be listening back to me as I lay awake, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the moan of the pipes, and my own breathing. I therefore accepted the position at the petrol station when it became available. I reasoned that strangers and noise would be preferable to quiet. As it happens, I was mistaken. Around 1:30 a.m., it began. I worked behind the counter. When the store phone rang, I was replenishing cigarette packs. This thing never rang. Now, not once during my 3 weeks of employment there. We have a staff emergency number and a company line for delivery. However, this was an outdated landline with a real cord and a fading sticky note that read, "Do not use." I looked at it for a moment before lifting it up. "Speedy fuel. This is Aaron." I introduced myself. Static. Then a tiny sound emerged through the crackle. It sounds more like breathing than a voice. Uneven, ragged, and slow. I said, "Hello. You okay?" The breathing ceased. After hanging up, I assumed it was a practical joke, that an inebriated man was calling random stations. However, it rang once more 10 minutes later. I remained silent this time. All I did was listen. It was apparent after a brief period of dead air. A whisper came through as day. A void hanging up. My throat became parched. "Who is this?" Static. No response. Then the unsteady, low voice reappeared. "It can now hear you." Click. The call ended. I discussed it with my co-worker, Angie, the following evening. She had been working the early shift 4 years and was in her mid-40s. When I told her, she laughed. "Oh, that old phone," she remarked as she lit a cigarette behind the trash can. "Yes, strange things do occasionally happen with that. Don't be concerned about it." "What kind of weird stuff?" I inquired. She gave a shrug. "Sometimes you'll hear voices." It was once linked to a payphone that was stolen years ago, according to the former manager. Most likely just a loose line or some other garbage. "Yes, perhaps," I said, but her voice didn't seem persuaded. She stopped at the door before heading out. "Hey, don't answer it if it rings again. Simply let it go." The fog returned on Saturday night, but it was deeper than previously. There were hardly any patrons, just one truck driver who loaded up and left without entering. I went to the back to replenish the beverages at around 3 in the morning. That constant hum, the kind of background noise you eventually lose awareness of, was always produced by the cooler. It halted that evening. I was holding a crate of Pepsi when I froze. My ears were filled with quiet. Then I heard a faint click, like a phone receiver being raised, coming from the far side of the cooler where the rear wall met the racks. I yelled, "Angie," even though I was well aware that I was by myself. Nothing. I leaned around the aisle after setting down the crate. After flickering once, the light above the cooler settled. I noticed an ancient door behind the cooler shelves as I took a closer look. It was something I had never noticed before, perhaps a utility room. I tried the handle, but it didn't move. The metal was colder than it ought to have been. I heard something that made my stomach flip as I leaned in to listen. From the other side of that door came slow, faint breathing. I drove off after backing away, locking up early, and sitting in my car for 20 minutes. Angie was halfway out the door when I arrived on Sunday night. "Hello, are you all right?" She looked at the bags beneath my eyes and inquired. The phone rang once more. "And there's something in the cooler room," I informed her. Her complexion turned pallid. "Have you opened it?" Made an effort. She gave a head shake. "Avoid doing so. Years ago, that room was sealed. Back there in the 1990s, an electrician was electrocuted. They simply walled off the wiring rather than fixing it." I gazed at her. "So why is the door there?" "Surpasses me. Don't return there, though, okay?" The phone called once again later that evening. The same one. The ancient corded phone with the warning not to use it. After staring at it for a long minute, I picked it up and hit record on my phone. Static at first, followed by a voice, whispering, "Male, exhausted. Don't respond if you can hear this." I gripped the receiver more tightly. "It learns your voice," the speaker went on. "It hears over the wires hum. It follows the sound once it recognizes you." Once more, static rose. And then I heard a tiny sound through the distortion. My name, my entire name, not just my name. I let go of the phone. Everything was captured on my Cell Z recording. However, when I replayed it, all I could hear was white noise and what sounded like 100 overlapping people trying to breathe simultaneously beneath it. I considered leaving, but I couldn't afford to lose another job and the rent was due. I therefore half expected the phone to be gone or the power to be out when I returned on Monday night. Everything appeared to be normal. Too typical. Dale, a regular from the area who drove for a delivery service, arrived around midnight. After purchasing coffee and striking up a conversation, he inquired about my well-being. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he stated. "That kind of thing," I whispered. He leaned in. "You heard it, didn't you?" I gave a blink. "Heard what?" He spoke more softly. The caller's voice. "Everyone who has been employed here for a sufficient amount of time has heard it." Before he vanished, my cousin worked nights, stated that the call had begun around a week prior. I chuckled uneasily. "You're playing tricks on me." Dale gave a head shake. "Man, this isn't a joke. Never pick up that phone again. Avoid touching it at all. Go if it calls your name. Whether it's outside, on the radio, or via the speakers in your fucking automobile doesn't matter. Go." Then he made a payment and departed without saying anything more. It took place on Tuesday. Like many nights, it began with a calm, half-asleep boredom. However, the door behind the cooler was open when I went to get a soda. Wide open, not simply unlocked. Something deep inside made a worried sound that sounded like an old tape recorder as cold air rushed out. I noticed letters etched onto the interior wall when I switched on my flashlight. The plaster was scraped with hundreds of overlapping lines. "Don't say anything. It is able to hear. Keep quiet." Circles and spirals were carved in what appeared to be black ash in the middle of the wall, spiraling inward and getting tighter until they came to a little square box on the ground. A reel tour recorder. There was still one ear reel spinning. Despite my want to run, my body remained motionless. The cassette made a hissing sound. Then there was a barely audible voice. "You ought not to have responded." The atmosphere changed. The cooler's hum ceased once more, and the light behind me flickered. I could hear it breathing directly behind me in that quiet. Shaking my flashlight, I whirled around. There was nothing but rows of soda bottles that reflected the light. Then there was a faint ringing sound from the store phone. I can't recall I reached for my phone. I can't recall ever hitting the record. All I know is that my hand trembled as I picked up the receiver. "Aaron." It was a lovely, almost soft voice. My chest constricted. "What are your desires?" "Your voice is already familiar to it. Don't hang up or it'll forget you," it said in a whisper. Then there was quiet. The breathing continued even after the line died. Through the ducts beneath the floor, it was suddenly present everywhere behind the counter. The phone was still audible even after I unplugged it from the wall. Somewhere in the room, there was a faint click as the receiver lifted. Gasping for air, I staggered outside and drove straight home. Angie gave me a call the following morning. "Are you okay? The register was left open by you." I said, "I'm done. I will not return." A pause occurred. Then she spoke softly. "Yes, I assumed. The petrol station caught fire 2 days later. They claimed that it began close to the cooler wire. Nobody was harmed. There was nobody present. According to the fire report, there was no room behind the cooler, no door, no electrical, no foundation." I erased the recording from my phone and relocated to towns away. Or at least, I initially moved to Ashbrook, nestled between the railroad with people involved, interacting, a one line that hadn't operated in years, and the Pine Ridges. The town was modest. More than anything, I had no intention of working in a cemetery. I was just searching for a quiet career that didn't I craved quiet after my divorce. I could probably live among the dead without anyone noticing, according to a joke my brother used to make. As it seems, he wasn't too far off. Ashbrook Cemetery was located approximately a mile past the final streetlight at the end of Willow Creek Road. Perhaps it wasn't very large, old, but no more than 30 acres. Old Civil War. You could hardly read a letter on some of the old stones. This is the type of location where fog builds up low and stays there all morning. In March, just before the rain started, I accepted the position. For 3 days in a row, it rained. Endless, gloomy, and cold. The type that permeates your clothing, your skeleton, and your mind. When I first saw her, I was mending the fence along the North Ridge. An umbrella that appeared to be from another century was carried by a woman wearing a long black dress as she strolled through the rows. I initially assumed she was a member of the family paying a visit to a tomb. She wasn't going toward any of the more recent areas, though, as I could see. She went directly to the far eastern end, where the earth slopes toward the row of ancient oaks that indicated the lot's earliest graves. I recall how thoughtful her movements were graceful and slow, like if they were strolling through memory. She had a little bundle of white lies with her. I observed her kneeling in front of a patch of grass from the tool shed that first day, without approaching her. Nothing, no marker, no headstone. She remained still for about 15 minutes. Then she put the lies down, got up, and left through the mist without turning around. I saw anything odd when she went past the barrier. Her tracks were not retained in the damp gravel. She came back by Sunday. The exact time is 4:30. The same veil, the same clothing, the same lies. I had begun to suspect that she might be related to one of the elderly caregivers. I looked through our office record book, which dates back to the 1880s, where she knelt. There was an empty plot and no one buried. Figures. That area had not seen a burial since 1912. I made the decision to talk to her the second Sunday. I tried to look professional when I spotted her entering the gate by wiping my hands on my coat, but I probably looked more like a wet dog. The mud was ankle deep in some places, and the rain hadn't stopped all week. I moved in closer as she knelt once again. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Do you frequently visit this place?" At first, she remained silent. Her umbrella was gently tapped by the rain. Then, as if humming a memory, she spoke in a low, melodic voice without raising her gaze. Her voice raised the hair on my arms every Sunday. "Would you mind telling me who you are visiting?" I spoke while attempting to maintain a steady tone. With every phrase, the black lace of her veil quivered as she cocked her head slightly. I scowled at my keeper. "Your custodian." "Yes," she muttered. "He kept an eye on us. He took care of the ground. He maintained the gate." Her tone and the way she said us, rather than me, sent a shiver down my spine. She got up before I could ask any more questions. She nodded to the vacant area, placed one final lily on the ground, and turned her back. "Wait," I said. "What was his name?" Her veil fluttered as she stopped at the edge of the path. She whispered. "He had many names, however. You now refer to him as Mr. Harlan, don't you? I was completely stopped by that. Before me, Mr. Harlan had been the caretaker. Last October, an elderly man passed away unexpectedly. They reported he had heart failure and was sitting upright in the chapel if he had dozed off in the middle of prayer. During my interview, I had only him once. How are you familiar with that name? She was already leaving when I inquired. Like smoke poured into the woods. Her black clothing disappeared into the mist. The rain that evening turned fierce. It appeared as though the cemetery was a drowning field. The trees are swaying in the wind, and water is collecting between the graves. I heard a tremendous boom that sounded like a tree cracking at around midnight. I stepped outside with my lantern in hand. As I pushed through the storm, the mud sucked at my boots. I came to a complete stop as I came to the eastern trail. The headstone of Mr. Harlan had split precisely in half. The break rested on a single white lily at its base, was spotless, smooth as glass, and shone with rainwater. It was the first time I had seen lies in that part. The petals were warm when I bent down to touch them. I heard the old chapel bell at that moment. The chapel doctor was locked and nobody was inside. Yet it rang once, low and hollow. I reported what I had witnessed to old Mr. Bykeham, the parish clerk. The following morning, he appeared uncomfortable. Are you certain it wasn't vandals? Sometimes children pass through there. Not in that weather, I replied. What about the break? It wasn't coerced. It appeared accurate. Thinking, he stroked his chin. You mentioned a black-clad woman, correct? Yes. Lies are carried by pale voices. He reached into the cupboard and took out a tiny book covered with dust. There was a Miss Ada Wren buried there. Lived close to the rectory until the 1890s. Visited the deceased groundskeeper once a week. I never skipped a Sunday. After his death, others thought she went insane. How did she end up? He paused. One morning, while kneeling at his grave by the oaks, I discovered her dead. I gave a blink. However, there isn't a grave there. He let out a sigh. The stone fell at some point in the 1950s. It was never replaced by us. According to records, she requested that no name be etched, said that it was just for him to be aware. I waited for her that Sunday. The fog curled low between the stones, denser than before. Even though the rain had ceased, I saw her approaching as the church bell had completed its final toll. The same route, same hour. I didn't conceal this time. I whispered, Miss Wren, as she got closer. I am aware of who you are. She halted, her hands gripping the lies more tightly. Do you? This is where you were buried a long time ago. The veil moved. I caught a glimmer of a smile. So why are you still able to hear me walking? The air around her felt suddenly chilly. Despite the softness of her voice, the fog appeared to shut in and get thicker. Why have you come here? I inquired. Why him? Why do they lie? He kept us, she said. Everyone who sleeps under these trees. He addressed the forgotten ones with kindness. Even as the world moved on, he never did. We therefore keep him company when the bell rings. Where I said it again. She cocked her head in the direction of the nearby graves. Do you not hear them? I became aware that the silence was incomplete for the first time. There was a faint murmur beneath the precipitation, like whispers through leaves. Then she turned to face me, and even though her eyes were obscured by the lace, I could sense them cold, far away, but aware. She whispered, You keep the gate now. As he did. Do you observe the dead? My mouth was dry when I tried to speak. I tried to. She gave one nod. You will soon notice them as well. She didn't go away. Instead, she vanished in that moment as the wind stirred. Simply vanished. All that was left were the lies, their petals pounded by the rain. Nothing happened for weeks, but then I began to notice small details. Overnight, tools were moved inside the shed. In the morning, the chapel door, which was always closed, would be open. I hadn't ignited the candles, but they were burning halfway down. Then I spotted her again one evening, who was mending the bulb over the entrance gate. Her black dress glistened slightly in the moonlight as she stood beneath the oaks. She remained motionless as I called out to her. Rather, she raised her hand and gestured to the chapel. My chest constricted in some way. The dirt crunched beneath my feet as I made my way toward it. The chapel door opened with a squeak. It was dark inside, and the air was heavy with the scent of wax and moist wood. Suddenly, there was a quiet dragging sound coming from the back pew. I lifted my lantern. A guy, or what appeared to be a man, sat straight in the last seat. His face was pale and waxy, like clay that had been shaped into a human. Open eyes, gazing directly ahead. Harlan was written on the name tag at his chest. The same Harlan whose grave was split. The bell above me rang once, twice, and 3 times before I could respond, each sound resonating in my bones. She was standing in the doorway as I turned. She said, "You shouldn't have followed. He remains vigilant." I retreated a step. "What are you hoping to get from me?" Her face was as pale as the moon under her slightly raised veil. She said, "To remember. Being remembered was all we ever wanted." Then the light from the candle flickered out. The pew was empty when it came back. They're both gone. I packed my bags that evening. However, something stopped me as I went outdoors. The chapel bell rang once more. However, the tower was not ringing. My head was ringing with it. She has been coming every Sunday since. The lies show up on Harlan's fractured stone every Sunday. I now occasionally hear her voice just behind me as I'm shutting the gate in a dense fog. Near, kind, almost compassionate. "Thomas, keep watch," she murmurs. "Maintain the gate." I saw the reflection in my window when I woke up last night, gently resting on my shoulders at a dark handprints. They weren't composed of mud this time, though. They were composed of ash, and the room was filled with the subtle scent. They were composed of ash, and the room was filled with the subtle scent. I started the job that still keeps me up at night when I was 34. I was employed by the Rowan County, Kentucky, County Maintenance Division back then. A peaceful, little area of land where people chat more quickly and time goes more slowly. Although it wasn't glamorous, my job was sufficient to cover my expenses. Clearing off old lots, repairing road signs, and mowing ditches. The county wanted everything cleaned up. Up until that fall, much of the labor was boring. Rick Halper, my boss, called me into the office on a Wednesday night. His eyes were shadowed by the brim of his cap as he leaned back in his chair and chewed on a toothpick. "Got something weird for you, Jesse," he stated. "You ever heard of Briar Hollow Cemetery?" I gave a head shake. He grumbled, unsurprised. "Can't say I have. Since the early 1990s, it has been removed from the county map. An old cemetery near Mill Creek Road was once a member of a private church, burned down following a fire at the caretaker's home. The county requests that we fix the fence and clear the access path. Children have been sneaking in once more. Do you want the hours? Extra time?" I inquired. He grinned. "Double. However, I'm warning you not to stay after dark." Locals heard tales of that location I departed from. Everyone in this area has a story about something haunted. Rick, he tapped the toothpick on his desk and replied, "Yeah, however, this one has a body count." That ought to have been my cue to decline. However, funds were limited, and I was expecting a child. I assured him that I would accept it. The sky was already bleeding orange when I drove there the following day. Asphalt gave way to gravel and finally dirt on the road. It became quieter the farther I went, as if the wood absorbed all sound. Halfway through, my GPS went dark. No signal, no service. The entry was merely a rusty archway with a briar hollow that could hardly be seen through the rust. Thick vines had crept up the posts, like they were attempting to drag them underground, and the gates were nowhere to be found. My truck could hardly get through. The path was clogged with vegetation. I was struck in the face by the air as soon as I went outside. It was cold enough to sting, heavy and moist. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and something somewhat metallic. I murmured, "This place looks like hell." I picked up my work. I started chopping back the vegetation close to the fence line with gloves, a pair of shears, and my headlamp. The snapping of vines reverberated more loudly than it should have. I eventually began talking to myself to pass the time. Then I heard what sounded like gravel footsteps. With the flashlight shaking in my palm, I froze. "Hi there, county maintenance. Is there anyone here?" Nothing. Just the sound of trees rustling. I made an effort to ignore it. Most likely just a deer, what was remained of the old caretaker's house. Though, when I turned to face it again, a light caught my eye. One of the blackened windows flickered with a soft gleam. It wasn't a firelight. It was too constant. I shouted out once more like a lantern. "Hey, you're not allowed inside. The county is in charge of this property." No answer. The light pulsed lightly, but remained motionless. I went toward it against my better judgment. What remained of the house was an ash and brick skeleton. The air inside smelled like rain on charcoal, and the majority of the roof had collapsed. My boots crunched on glass and burned wood as I cautiously moved across the rubble. I noticed it at that point. A lantern with a delicate blue flame hanging from a rusty nail in the wall. Beside it, half buried in the ground, was a bronze nameplate fastened to an ancient keyring. I read the engraving after wiping away the grime. The Elam is the groundskeeper. It sounded like a familiar name. I had heard it before, but I couldn't identify it. Then I recalled. When Rick informed me the specifics of the assignment, he had mentioned the name of the caretaker. The individual who was allegedly killed in the fire in 1989 was Ernest Lam. His body was never found again. Without thinking, I put the keys in my pocket. That was the first error. The sun had set by the time I was done loading debris and cutting. A dense fog drifted in from the forest, curling like Earth's own breath between the graves. The crickets were no longer audible, and the wind. I saw something at that moment that made my blood freeze. The headlights on my pickup were on. I was aware I would turn them off. I had the keys in the pocket of my jacket. "Don't do this to me," I said as I jogged over. However, as I got to the truck, I noticed a shape someone standing behind me reflected in the glass. I whirled around. There he stood, an elderly man with a lantern in hand and a burned uniform. His skin was curled and waxy like melted plastic, and his face was half scorched. He just stood there, breathing slowly, and muttered, "You're on my grounds," in a voice that sounded like it came from underground. His eyes were dark pits that caught the light in an incomprehensible way. I quickly retreated, my boots slipping through the mud. "I'm with the county. Man, you." He lifted the lamp. "The grounds are closed. Keep them tidy." The temperature dropped by 10. My breath became hazy. My flashlight went out. The lantern then went out. I can't recall ever running. All I can recall is slicing through the woods and continuing until I reached the dirt road. When I eventually turned to look behind me, all I saw was fog. The following morning, I returned with Rick and Bo, another employee. Rick was uncomfortable but doubtful. "Are you certain you saw more than your own reflection?" I pointed to the dirt by my truck and said, "Rick, there was a person standing there." He bent over. The footsteps were deep, blackened, and naked. Bo scowled. "Those aren't fresh at all." After that, we didn't talk much, but when I opened the door of my vehicle, my old brass keys were neatly resting on the driver's seat. They weren't there because of me. 4 words were also etched from the inside of the windshield. "Keep the grounds tidy." A week later, I left the county, told him it had to do with his health. In all honesty, I had to see that lantern light behind my eyelids in order to fall asleep. They permanently fenced off Briar Hollow a few months later. On top is a tall chain link barbed wire. It is no longer approached by anyone, not even the hunters, not the children. However, I occasionally still see it late at night while I'm traveling along Mill Creek. There was a faint yellow light that moved slowly through the fog between the trees, as if someone was still strolling the fence line, taking care of the graves and maintaining the grounds. I started working as a night watchman at Pine Hollow Cemetery, which is located just outside of Redfield, Pennsylvania, when I was 31. Quiet was the only thing I wanted at the time. After the steel plant closed, I lost my work there. Soon after, my marriage had collapsed, and I was living in a rented duplex with a subtle mildew and loneliness odor. I thought, why not? When the township office put out a flyer seeking a part-time cemetery groundskeeper, it came with a modest cabin on my land, but the price was low. The silence seemed to be just what I needed. Pine Hollow was an ancient cemetery, but it was not very large. The type of location that no longer appears on local maps. The oldest area was tucked away in the trees, the stones so worn that the names were hardly readable. Lichen and moss clambered over angels made of stone. It bore that heavy quiet that is only present in areas that have witnessed excessive grief, even throughout the day. I had a dull first week. I would sweep the chapel stairs, check for vandalism, unlock the rusting front gate, and trim the overgrown grass along the walkways, and record any upkeep in an old journal that Harold Reeves, the last caretaker, left behind. The record indicated that he had been employed there for almost 20 years. His handwriting was nice, steady, and cursive at first, but it became frenetic and inconsistent toward the end. The final entry, dated March 12, 1994, said only, "He's walking again." At the time, I didn't give it much thought. It was presumably an inside joke. I'd been accustomed to working nights by the second week. I would pack a thermos of coffee, turn down the cabin radio, and read while the sickers hummed outside. It was an easy task. Make sure no one has jumped the fence by checking the grounds twice a night. However, there was something about that place's silence that began to irritate me. The air seemed to thicken every night after midnight, as if the forest surrounding the cemetery were becoming closer. One evening at around 1 in the morning, the sound of metal clinking softly like a chain being dragged caught my attention as I was strolling along the rear trail close to the ancient Civil War part. I froze. The wind has completely subsided. When I pointed my flashlight in the direction of the noise, I saw the silhouette of a towering object standing between the headstones. I said, "Hello," attempting to seem more courageous than I actually was. No answer. The eye could see the faint glitter of brass buttons on what appeared to be an ancient military coat, but the person remained motionless. A long, dark blue, nearly black wool garment that I had only ever seen in museums. I moved forward one step. "You shouldn't be in here, sir." Nothing yet. It was just the quiet that was creeping in. Then it became deliberate, slow, unsurprised, and uninterested. Simply became like it had anticipated me. As the beam hit his face, the flashlight shook in my palm. Dark and sunken eyes, pale and expressionless. His skin appeared as thin as paper that had been exposed to the light for too long. He vanished as soon as I blinked. Simply vanished. Even the trees behind him didn't tremble as if someone had passed through them. I returned to the cabin, unlocked the door, and continued to sit with the lights on till dawn. I made an effort to justify it the following morning. Perhaps I was obviously exhausted. Perhaps I was being tricked by a local child dressed in a costume. However, I discovered something I couldn't shake when I stepped outside to inspect the location. There were hefty, antiquated boot prints dug firmly into the moist dirt, visible as day. The design resembled hobnails, something more akin to Civil War boots than contemporary footwear. The following morning, I reported it to the township, and Eileen, the secretary, laughed softly. "Oh, you must have seen the Union man," she replied. "What? Since I was a child, people in this area have been discussing him. Some claim that he is one of the soldiers interred there whose name was never inscribed in stone. Don't be alarmed by it, sweetie. Every caregiver claims to have seen him." I made an effort to ignore it. Even so, I kept the cabin's lights on until daybreak. After 2 weeks, the uneasiness changed into something more intimate. That evening, it was pouring. There is a light drizzle on the cabin's roof. I heard footsteps outside at midnight. The kind of walk that makes you feel more in your chest than here is slow and deliberate. Perhaps a deer strayed nearby, I reasoned, so I took my flashlight outside. Nothing but dense enough fog to engulf the beam that curled around the tombstones. I almost dropped the lamp as I turned to get back inside. The man in the uniform was standing near the gate, perhaps 30 yards away, silently observing. "Hey," I stepped forward and yelled, "You need to leave. This is private property." He remained still, didn't blink at all. His garments didn't darken, as if they weren't even getting wet, even though the rain trickled down his coat and hat. He raised his arm slightly and gestured toward the woods behind me as I took another stride. Then he was gone once more as my flashlight flickered. I couldn't stop wondering what he had meant by that gesture that evening. I made the decision to check the woods by daylight. A little creek was reached by a narrow trail that wound around the older burials. I discovered something out of place halfway down, a foot-tall wooden crucifix embedded in the ground. It had a corroded tin star pinned to it, but no name. The earth behind it appeared disturbed, as if it had been excavated and replaced a long time ago. The following day, I mentioned it to Eileen. Old Harold used to mention that spot. She continued, "Town records say they buried unclaimed soldiers there during the war. Just field graves, no markers." She smiled softly at me and said, "Poor souls, maybe he's just looking for recognition." Before one chilly November night, weeks went by without any problems, and I began to think perhaps I had dreamed it all. I was outdoors attempting to restart the generator, but it had cut out at around 2 in the morning, when I heard a faint humming sound that sounded like a low, repetitive melody carried through the fog. It had a marching, almost military tone. Rhythm that is worn out and outdated. I just listened after turning off the flashlight. Boot steps crunched on gravel as the humming became closer and louder. Go slowly and steadily. With my heart racing, I retreated. Who is present? No answer. It was the same humming that rose to the level of a voice singing softly. The tone was deep and melancholy, sounding like pain itself, but the words were too weak to be heard. I staggered back to the cabin, slammed the door, and leaned my back against it as I listened. 3 knocks followed the halt of the footsteps outside the porch. Even slow. Knock, knock, knock. I muttered to myself, "Avoid opening it. You dare not open it." However, curiosity has the power to overcome fear. I moved slowly in the direction of the peephole. Nothing. It's just fog and rain. Then, just as I was about to move away, a pale fingers touched the glass from the other side. I almost fell over the chair when I leapt back so quickly. The hand had vanished by the time I collected myself. I discovered the identical boot prints walking up to my porch the following morning, but none heading out. It ceased to be merely a narrative at that point. I visited the community and spoke with Pastor Jeff, who had been performing funerals there for many years. His face darkened as I told him what I had witnessed. He said, "Son, there are things on that ground older than this town itself. Yes, soldiers, but also forgotten people. Not all of them saw the conclusion of the conflict. At times, they simply continue to stroll." He told me of a 1960s caretaker who departed after discovering muddy footprints inside the chapel every night for a week, despite the doors being locked. Another claimed to have witnessed a row of people in faded uniforms standing guard close to the western fence. Eyes empty, faces blank. He said, "You don't need to be scared, just be respectful. They're not pursuing you, they are merely recalling." I went to the unmarked graves on the far side of the cemetery that evening with a lantern. There, the air was damp and seemed cooler and quiet. I raised the lantern and spoke out as I stood in front of that little wooden crucifix. "I don't know your name," I replied in a trembling voice. "However, I notice you. I am aware that you were present." With rustling leaves and shifting fog, the forest seemed to breathe around me. Then, like a whisper on the wind, I heard the same low voice again, but very faintly. "Home." After that, there was stillness. After one flicker, the lantern extinguished. After that night, I never saw him again. The generator ceased to cut out. The boot prints were never found again. However, I occasionally sense it when I pass the older cemeteries, the weight in the air like a silent acceptance, like someone watching from just out of sight. When I was organizing the tool shed a month later, I discovered an old envelope hidden behind a loose board. The paper was fragile and yellowed. A blurry black and white photograph of a line of Union soldiers in front of a wooden fence was found inside. The words Pine Hollow, 1864, 21st Regiment Company D, were inscribed in fading ink on the reverse. I gasped at one of the faces in the photo. The same man, the same weary face, the same hollow eyes. That night, when the fog still gathered like memories, I put the picture back in the envelope and placed it beneath the wooden cross. I continued to serve as a caregiver for an additional 2 years. I would stroll the path between the stones every night, and occasionally, when the moon was low and the wind had died, I would be. I had no intention of living with the dead for half of my life. When I started working at Riverside Memorial Cemetery in 1997, it was just meant to be a temporary position to help me get by once the plant closed. In a Rust Belt town that most people had forgotten about, I was 23 years old, broke, and sleeping on my cousin's couch, nestled between an old freight line and a piece of woods on the outskirts of Harland, Ohio, was the cemetery. Though it was only around 3 acres in size, it had more history than anything else in that town. The earliest stones were created in the 1860s, names nearly scraped away, cracked and leaning like terrible teeth. The groundskeeper in front of me, old Mr. Parson, was almost blind and unable to operate the mower. With a shaky hand, he gave me the keys and whispered something that I can still clearly recall. "It's difficult to sleep here, boy. After sundown, always keep the gate shut." I dismissed it with a joke at the moment. In Ohio, every elderly man with arthritis has a ghost story. However, I stopped laughing that first winter. The cemetery office was a small, claustrophobic hut with peeling blue paint and a wood furnace that produced more smoke than heat. Since no one else volunteered to work the night shift, I did, in order to keep an eye out for vandals or youngsters slipping in to drink. The city paid extra for after-hours supervision, which primarily involved sitting in the shack from 10 p.m. till daylight. I would pack a deck of cards, a portable radio, and a thermos of coffee. When I was too exhausted to sit still, I would occasionally use my flashlight to walk the walkways between graves. The town was peaceful, the kind of peace that gives you the impression that you are submerged. I got to know the head caretaker, Harvey Boone, during my second week. He was a large man with a beard that reached his chest and a voice that sounded like a broken muffler. He has been employed there since the 1970s. He referred to everyone as children, regardless of age. One night, he told me, "Kid, don't be fooled by the silence. In this place, things move. Here, the wind fluctuates strangely. You'll see." I grinned. "Do you mean ghosts?" "I mean the kind of quiet that remembers," he remarked, leaning back in his chair and picking up a splinter from his palm. I didn't request an explanation from him. It was just after midnight in late February. As soon as I saw him, the small flakes of snow, which float in the air like dust, were falling. I noticed movement close to the north gate when I was using my flashlight to make rounds. Just past the barrier, a statue-like person stood motionless. I initially believed it to be a child, perhaps 14 or 15 years old. He wore suspenders that appeared too short and an old-fashioned coat that was buttoned up to the throat. His damp hair cascaded over his forehead. "Hey," I shouted, "you're not supposed to be out there this late." With his boots crunching in the snow, he approached without moving. "You hear me, kid?" His eyes were wide and as pale blue as fogged glass, and he just gazed. Then there was a flash of lightning above the hill, and I swear I could see right through him for a split second, as if his silhouette vanished into the tempest. He was gone as I blinked. I looked over the field beyond the fence, the road, and the ditch. Nothing. No traces of footprints. Just the sound of the wind blowing through the trees and the snow. I kept it a secret from Harvey. I kept it a secret because, at 3 in the morning, when all you have is caffeine and dead company, the mind can play tricks. Harvey stopped by a few nights later to deliver supplies. Chewing tobacco as if it were breakfast, he appeared exhausted. "Have you seen the gate boy yet?" Abruptly, he asked. "What?" He spat onto the snow. "When it storms, that tiny bastard appears. Existed prior to my commencement. He's referred to as Riverside's gate boy." I attempted to chuckle, but it appeared skinny. "Are you serious?" "Yes, indeed. Arrives at the north gate and appears to be waiting for someone. Don't speak, stay put." Then, poof, it was gone. He gave a shrug. He eventually catches the attention of every groundskeeper. Fortunate if only once. Who should he be? Harvey rubbed his chin. "No one is aware. Old graves can be found around the ridge. Long ago, flood removed the names from him. Perhaps one of those children, or perhaps simply observing the storm as it develops. I tried to shift the topic, but when I poured coffee that evening, my hands continued to shake. After a week, from the west came another storm. The window panes were shook by the loud crack of thunder. I heard something outside at midnight. Metal is being scraped. I reached for my flashlight and went out onto the porch. I was almost knocked off my feet by the wind. The north gate was shrieking like a hinge from hell as it swung open and closed. And there he was, once more. The boy, the same location, the same drenched attire, the same fixed gaze. "Youngster," I shouted, "you must return home. This is not a safe place." He gave me a small head tilt, as if he was observing me. Then he held out one hand and gestured past me to the back of the cemetery, where the oldest tombs were located beneath the willow trees. "What? You want me to leave?" "There," I yelled. No answer. It was the same slow head tilt. One more lightning strike. Absent, I went where he had indicated the following morning. There was uneven ground, headstones buried with moss and partially submerged. I dismissed one and experienced what felt like a cold for the first time. Pulse beneath my palm, as if the ground were trembling. Caleb Morris, 1885, 1893, 8 years old, was written on the stone. The following day, I went to the county archives and informed the clerk that I was researching the history of the cemetery. She brought me to a row of ledgers that smelled like damp paper and were covered in dust. A few hours later, I located him. The record states that Caleb Morris, the son of Samuel and Lydia Morris, perished in a winter accident. Not specifics, but another. I noticed the entry. Same place, same date. Riverside's north entrance gate collapsed. He had been struck by a metal gate. According to the record, his father attempted to move it, but the youngster had already left when assistants arrived. I shut the book and sat there gazing at my image in the archive window's glass. It wasn't long before the following storm arrived. A few nights later, the air buzzed like a faulty wire and the sky took on the hue of bruises. I waited after parking my pickup near the office. It was midnight. Nothing. 1 a.m. nothing. Then I heard it. Iron and stone clang slowly 3 times. Upon arriving at the north gate, the padlock was not locked. The gate creaked softly in the wind as it stood open. Caleb was standing inside, beneath the maple tree. He wasn't outside this time. I said, "Caleb," before I even understood what I had said. He slowly turned to face me, as though it hurt. I swear on my life, I heard the tiniest murmur as his lips opened. My stomach fell when you opened it. A bolt of lightning split the sky, and I noticed something behind him. Little, half-formed shapes that resemble children standing in a row created of mist. After then, they vanished. I bolted back to the hut, slammed the door, and remained there till dawn, trembling so much that I spilled coffee on my jeans. I told Harvey everything when he arrived in the morning. "You need to leave that gate shut, son," he stated after giving it a good look. "You're not supposed to respond to him." For some time, things became more peaceful. Spring arrived. The grass thickened once again. The river began to melt. I made an effort to tell myself that it was all in my head. Caffeine, sleep deprivation, and possibly even carbon monoxide from that ancient heater. Then, one May morning, I discovered tiny, naked tracks in the mud that led directly to Caleb's tomb from the north gate. Harvey and I were the only ones with keys. I headed over to Harvey's house that afternoon to tell him. With tears in her eyes, his wife opened the door. She reported that Harvey passed away yesterday night. They believe it is a heart attack. My legs almost gave out. I returned to work tonight after the funeral because I was at a loss for what to do. There was a sense of impending doom in the air. I packed additional lanterns, and I lit them all. Around midnight, the storm arrived. Rain crashed sideways against the windows, thunder rolled, and the wind howled. Then the lights in the office flickered and went out. The sound of footsteps sounded from outside, just strolling slowly across the damp grass, not running. With my heart racing, I got to my feet. I yelled out, "Harvey," but I knew better. Quiet. Next, the north gate, creak, I picked up the flashlight, entered the storm, and went down the trail. In my grasp, the beam trembled. The gate was wide open when I arrived at the hill. Standing closer than ever, perhaps 10 feet away, was Caleb. Water dripped from his hair, and the lightning had turned his complexion grey. "Why do you keep opening it?" I yelled above the wind. "What do you want?" He blinked slowly before speaking in a scarcely discernible voice. "At home," he gestured behind me. As I turned, I noticed that the graves along the crest were gently glowing, as if the ground was remembering them. Every stone has a figure standing over it. Dozens of kids were observing me. The wind ceased. Everything became motionless. The ground beneath my feet began to quake in that silence. The graves started to sink one by one, as if something were scraping its way up from below. The soil collapsed inward. I bolted. I can't recall how I returned to the shack, only that the lock was gone, and my hands were covered in dirt. As I closed the door behind me, there was only melted metal on the floor. The following morning, I gave up. Didn't he? On the floor. The following morning, I gave up. Didn't he? I had no intention of living with the dead for half of my life. When I started working at Riverside Memorial Cemetery in 1997, it was just meant to be a temporary position to help me get by once the plant closed. In a Rust Belt town that most people had forgotten about, I was 23 years old, broke, and sleeping on my cousin's couch. Nestled between an old freight line and a piece of woods on the outskirts of Harland, Ohio, was the cemetery. Though it was only around 3 acres in size, it had more history than anything else in that town. The earliest stones were created in the 1860s, names nearly scraped away, cracked and leaning like terrible teeth. The groundskeeper in front of me, old Mr. Parson, was almost blind and unable to operate the mower. With a shaky hand, he gave me the keys and whispered something that I can still clearly recall. "It's difficult to sleep here, boy. After sundown, always keep the gate shut." I dismissed it with a joke at the moment. In Ohio, every elderly man with arthritis has a ghost story. However, I stopped laughing that first winter. The cemetery office was a small, claustrophobic hut with peeling blue paint and a wood furnace that produced more smoke than heat. Since no one else volunteered to work the night shift, I did, in order to keep an eye out for vandals or youngsters slipping in to drink. The city paid extra for after-hours supervision, which primarily involved sitting in the shack from 10 p.m. till daylight. I would pack a deck of cards, a portable radio, and a thermos of coffee. When I was too exhausted to sit still, I would occasionally use my flashlight to walk the walkways between graves. The town was peaceful, the kind of peace that gives you the impression that you are submerged. I got to know the head caregiver, Harvey Boone, during my second week. He was a large man with a voice like a broken muffler and a beard that reached his chest. He has been employed there since the 1970s. He referred to everyone as children, regardless of age. One night, he told me, "Kid, don't be fooled by the silence. In this place, things move. Here, the wind fluctuates strangely. You'll see." I grinned. "Do you mean ghosts?" "I mean the kind of quiet that remembers," he remarked, leaning back in his chair and picking up a splinter from his palm. I didn't request an explanation from him. It was just after midnight in late February. As soon as I saw him, light snow was falling, those delicate particles that float like dust in the atmosphere. I noticed movement close to the north gate when I was using my flashlight to make rounds. Just past the barrier, a statue-like person stood motionless. I initially believed it to be a child, perhaps 14 or 15 years old. He wore suspenders that appeared too short and an old-fashioned coat that was buttoned up to the throat. His hair was slicked down and damp. Above his forehead, "Hey," I shouted, "you're not supposed to be out there this late." With his boots crunching in the snow, he approached without moving. "You hear me, kid?" His eyes were wide and as pale blue as fogged glass, and he just gazed. Then there was a flash of lightning above the hill, and I swear I could see right through him for a split second, as if his silhouette vanished into the tempest. He was gone as I blinked. I looked over the field beyond the fence, the road, and the ditch. Nothing. no traces of footprints, just the sound of the wind blowing through the trees and the snow. I kept it a secret from Harvey. I kept it a secret because, at 3 in the morning, when all you have is caffeine and dead company, the mind can play tricks. A few evenings later, Harvey stopped by to deliver the materials, chewing tobacco as if it were breakfast. He appeared exhausted. "Have you seen the gate boy yet?" he inquired abruptly. He spat into the snow. "The what?" "That tiny jerk who appears during a storm. Existed prior to my commencement. He is referred to as Riverside's gate boy." I made an effort to chuckle, but it sounded hollow. "Are you serious?" "Yes, indeed. Arrives at the north gate and appears to be waiting for someone. Don't move, don't speak, and suddenly poof, you're gone." He gave a shrug. "He eventually catches the attention of every groundskeeper. Fortunate if only once. Who should he be?" Harvey rubbed his chin. "No one is aware. Old graves can be found around the ridge. Long ago, flood removed the names from him. Perhaps one of those children, or perhaps simply observing the storm as it develops." I attempted to shift the topic, but my hands continued to tremble when that evening I poured coffee. Another storm arrived from the west a week later. The window panes were shook by the loud crack of thunder. I heard something outside at midnight. Metal is being scraped. I reached for my flashlight and went out onto the porch. I was almost knocked off my feet by the wind. The north gate was shrieking like a hinge from hell as it swung open and closed. And there he was once more. The boy, the same location, the same drenched attire, the same fixed gaze. I shouted, "Kid, you must return home. This is not a safe place." He gave me a small head tilt, as if he was observing me. Then he held out one hand and gestured past me to the back of the cemetery, where the oldest tombs were located beneath the willow trees. "What? Do you want me to visit that place?" I yelled. No answer. It was the same slow head tilt. One more lightning strike. Absent, I went where he had indicated the following morning. There was uneven ground, headstones buried with moss and partially submerged. For the first time, I felt as though the soil itself was trembling beneath my palm as I swept one off. Caleb Morris, 1885, 1893, 8 years old, was written on the stone. The following day, I went to the county archives and informed the clerk that I was researching the history of the cemetery. She brought me to a row of ledgers that smelled like damp paper and were covered in dust. A few hours later, I located him. The record states that Caleb Morris, the son of Samuel and Lydia Morris, perished in a winter accident. There were no specifics, but I noticed another entry. Same place, same date. Riverside's north entrance gate collapsed. He had been struck by a metal gate. According to the record, his father attempted to move it, but the youngster had already left when assistance arrived. I shut the book and sat there gazing at my image in the archive window's glass. It wasn't long before the following storm arrived. 2 nights later, the air buzzed like a faulty wire and the sky took on the color of bruises. My truck was parked close to the business and held out. It was midnight. Nothing. 1 a.m. nothing. Then I heard it. Iron and stone clanged slowly 3 times. The padlock was unlatched when I arrived at the north gate. The gate creaked softly in the wind as it stood open. Caleb was standing inside, beneath the maple tree. He wasn't outside this time. I said, "Caleb," before I even understood what I had said. He slowly turned to face me, as though it hurt. I swear on my life, I heard the tiniest murmur as his lips opened. My stomach fell when you opened it. A bolt of lightning split the sky, and I noticed something behind him. Small, half-formed shapes, like a line of mist-made children. After then, they vanished. I bolted back to the hut, slammed the door, and remained there till dawn, trembling so much that I spilled coffee on my jeans. I told Harvey everything when he arrived in the morning. "You need to leave that gate shut, son," he stated after giving it a good look. "You're not supposed to respond to him." Things settled down for a time. Spring arrived. The grass thickened once again. The river began to melt. I made an effort to tell myself that it was all in my head. Caffeine, sleep deprivation, and possibly even carbon monoxide from that ancient heater. Then, one May morning, I discovered Tiny. naked tracks in the mud that led directly to Caleb's tomb from the north gate. Harvey and I were the only ones with keys. I headed over to Harvey's house that afternoon to tell him. With tears in her eyes, his wife opened the door. She reported that Harvey passed away yesterday night. They believe it is a heart attack. My legs almost gave out. I returned to work tonight after the funeral because I was at a loss for what to do. There was a sense of impending doom in the air. I packed additional lanterns, and I lit them all. Around midnight, the storm arrived. The wind howled. Rain smashed sideways against the windows as thunder rolled. Then the lights in the office flickered and went out. The sound of footsteps sounded from outside, just strolling slowly across the damp grass, not running. With my heart racing, I got to my feet. I yelled out, "Harvey," but I knew better. Quiet. Next, proceed to the north gate. I picked up the flashlight, entered the storm, and went down the trail. In my grasp, the beam trembled. The gate was wide open when I arrived at the hill. Standing closer than ever, perhaps 10 feet away, was Caleb. Water dripped from his hair, and the lightning had turned his complexion grey. "Why do you keep opening it?" Over the wind, I yelled. "What do you want?" He blinked slowly, then uttered, scarcely audible, "Home." He gestured behind me. As I turned, I noticed that the graves along the crest were gently glowing, as if the ground was remembering them. Every stone has a figure standing over it. Dozens of kids were observing me. The wind ceased. Everything became motionless. The ground beneath my feet began to quake in that silence. The graves started to sink one by one, as if something were scraping its way up from below. The soil collapsed inward. I bolted. I can't recall how I returned to the shack, only that the lock was gone, and my hands were covered in dirt. As I closed the door behind me, there was only melted metal on the floor. The following morning, I gave up. Didn't even get paid. The following morning, I gave up. Didn't even get paid. Since I really didn't have much else going for me, I accepted the position of caretaker at Hollow Creek Memorial. It was early October, the time of year when the scent of cold metal and rain-soaked leaves permeates the air. Since the Wishaw mill closed, I had been without a reliable job for several months. Old Man Tiller, the proprietor, had assured us that whenever things improved, we would all be invited back. They never did. I therefore desired lodging in Hollow Creek Cemetery. To seeing the notice posted at the post office. Given, I thought, hell, why not? Cemeteries didn't frighten me. I grew up among little town cemeteries, the kind where, on Easter picnics, your own family members gaze back at you from headstones. In addition, Hollow Creek was peaceful, perhaps too quiet. I was drawn to that. The little 2-room caretaker's cabin was located just past the north gate, hut with green paint chips and a stovepipe that whistled in response to river winds. On my first night there, I could hear insects humming against the window screen and frogs calling from the creek. It was peaceful in its own peculiar way, but I should have realized that peace in such settings is short-lived. Walter Crane is my name. I used to be called Walt by people in Renshaw. I'm 52 now. I've worked nights 4 years, and if I've learned anything, it's that stillness can deceive you. Sections of the 12 Acre Cemetery date back to the 1800s, near the chapel. The more recent graves were arranged in tidy rows with plastic flowers and polished granite stones. However, not many people went to the historic area along the summit. The oldest markers were tilted like inebriated people awake due to the way the earth had crumbled around them. The majority of my shifts during the first several weeks were devoted to maintaining the chapel's lighting for weekend services, as well as fixing fences, lines, and undergrowth. Easy work, however. There were also strange things. For example, one morning, even though I was the only one with a key, I discovered all the chapel pew cushions neatly placed in the aisle, or when I observed that the flowers from the older graves, particularly those close to the east path, had been neatly organized into concentric circles overnight. "Kids," stated Mr. Holman, the grounds supervisor. "High school students playing about. Don't give it too much thought." I didn't. Not initially. The fog crept in abruptly, and thickly the night it began, as if someone had spilled milk into the sky. Hollow Creek always had its moods, even though the forecast hadn't called for it. As I completed my rounds, shutting the chapel doors, my lantern's light flickered dimly across the gravel walkway. At that moment, I saw movement at the edge of the light. Beyond the eastern trail, I initially thought it might be a vagrant or a deer slicing through. However, I was able to see them when I squinted through the mist. 10, perhaps 12 figures in a row. They were traveling slowly and in a single file, nearly ritualistic. High collars, long black coats, and mourner-shrouded faces. Nobody had a light. Nobody sounded. I shouted in the evening, but the fog drowned out my voice. People, cemeteries are closed. No response. They simply continued to move in the direction of the hill, which is the oldest part of the property. My stomach constricted. No funeral had been planned for that evening. "Hey," I yelled once more. "Do you hear me?" Nothing yet. I moved closer, my boots crunching on the gravel. I could hear my own footsteps too loudly. One of them turned just enough, but not completely, when I was about 30 yards away. That under the veil, I caught a glimpse of pale flesh. Then they all came to a complete stop. The fog was breathing between us, I swear. Then, silently, they resumed their ascent toward the mountain top. I felt compelled to follow, either out of obligation or foolish curiosity. The fog grew thicker as I ascended, and the eastern route was slippery with dampness. The flame in my lantern wavered as it battled the moist air. Ahead, I could still make out the little rhythmic sway of their coats. There were no voices or footsteps, just that silent, steady march. My lungs burnt by the time I got to the top. The deserted clearing was illuminated by the lantern light. The ground was disturbed, but there were no people, no candles, and no recently excavated graves. Dozens more footprints were buried deep in the ground, creating a perfect circle around the clearing's center. I ran my fingers over the prints. Beneath the freezing soil, I sensed a slight, but genuine tremor that resembled the sound of a far-off bell. I felt a chill, and then I heard a voice behind me, soft close to my ear. "Are you not late?" I almost dropped the lamp because I was spinning so quickly. There is nothing there, only fog whispering against the stones, curling near. My heart pounded. Who is present? Quiet. The sound came when the flame extinguished after flickering once and again. Soft, purposeful boots around me in the darkness. I sensed movement, such as air being forced by invisible bodies, a cold touch on the back of my neck, and a brush across my sleeve. "Show yourselves," I shouted. Dozens of voices murmured over one another as the whispers grew louder. Finally, he has arrived. It's too late. It's too late. I fell to my knees. I had the impression that something was moving beneath me, since the ground felt hollow. Inhaling, my hands fell into the ground. I came up something whitish and soft when I freed them. Bone. Then there was quiet. The mist cleared. The clearing was deserted. The circle of footsteps was all that was left. With trembling hands, I filled that little hole and staggered back toward the cabin. I could hear footsteps right behind me the entire way down. They were quiet, deliberate, and matched my own. I was afraid to turn around. I didn't get much sleep that night. My skin crawled at every creak in the cottage. I heard pebbles moving outside my window at around 3 in the morning. Step by step, step by step. I could see the hilltop gleaming dimly through the curtain, as though 100 spectral candles were burning in the mist. "God, help me," was said at the front of the procession. I recognized myself. They were being led uphill by a man in my black cloak who was holding my lantern. 4 weeks, I kept it a secret. Then Holman stopped by with coffee one morning. He appeared pallid. "You've been up the East Hill lately?" inquired the man. I paused. "Why?" He massaged his jaw. "Discovered prints up once more. Fresh. Dozens of them in a circle." He looked at me as if he didn't want to accept what he had spoken. "It rained last night," he said. "Soft ground. Any ancient tracks should have been swept away. However, he faded off. They are deeply compressed, as to boots that have never been raised." The fog returned to nights later. This time, it was thicker. It tasted like iron wet and harsh. With the window shutters closed, I remained inside the caretaker's home. However, the marching resumed about 2 in the morning. The same unseen feet beat a steady, heavy cadence on the gravel. Then there was a knock. 3 gentle hugs to the door. I froze. Who is present? I succeeded. No response. 3 more smacks, spaced precisely apart. I opened the door an inch against my better judgment. I could see a man standing just past the threshold through the fog that was pouring in. A lantern-wielding man in a dark coat with a veiled face. My lantern. He looked up a little. Beneath the veil, I recognized my own face. Then he turned and started up the path to the east. Then came the parade. I'm drawn like something under a spell, and I don't recall grabbing my jacket or how my hands trembled as I followed. We came to the same circle of tracks on the mountaintop once more. There was something different this time, though. There was only one open grave in the middle. The figures in veils came to a halt and faced me. They raised their veils one by one. Sunken eyes, pale faces, and breathless whispering mouths. One of them remarked, in a voice as dry as dust, "You led us once. Take the lead once more." I staggered back. No, I'm not. But beneath me, the ground collapsed. The lantern collapsed, the dirt smothering its flames. The chill encircled me. Their departing footsteps were the last sound I heard. Go slowly and methodically. Go back down the slope. A week later, they discovered the caretaker's cabin was deserted. The stove remains toasty. In the middle of a sentence, the logbook on the table stopped. There will be a lot of fog tonight. Once more, I hear them. Since then, the East Hill has been cordoned off. However, people in Hollow Creek continue to discuss it. You can hear the faint cadence of boots walking in a complete circle across the gravel on foggy nights. Occasionally, if you stay close to the gate long enough, you can see the brightness of a lantern guiding the solemn procession up the hill as it weaves through the mist. It's the caretaker, they say. They claim he continues to stroll among them. Additionally, if you yell, he will turn just enough so that you can see your own face through the mist. Bills don't give a damn about sleep schedules, but I never imagined that I would be the type of person who works evenings again. I left Chicago after my divorce and settled in Brookhaven, a small village along Route 17. I required tranquility. Something different was what I needed. On the outskirts of town, I got a job at a 24-hour petrol station. The coffee at Carter's Fuel and Mart tastes like burnt dirt and the floor tiles are perpetually sticky. But it pays off. Time, Ralph, a middle-aged former truck driver who appeared to have lost his smile since the 90 seconds, and I worked the graveyard shift from 1000 p.m. to 6 a.m. Linda, the manager, was nice but seldom stayed after dark. No one did. Ralph and I were the only ones left in the store with its buzzing fluorescent lights after everyone clocked out before the sun set. "This place gets weird after midnight," Ralph used to say. I would dismiss it with a laugh. I had previously worked nights. I've witnessed everything, from raccoons fighting over trash cans to drunks and tweakers. However, nothing had prepared me for what lay ahead. At first, the nights were slow, just Ralph and myself and the sound of the refrigerators. We would count the drawers, prepare fresh coffee, stock shelves, and mop floors. Occasionally, a local would get a six-pack before leaving for home, or a truck driver would swing by for petrol. I rented a tiny duplex 5 minutes away. My life had turned into a circle. Work, take a shower, go to bed, and repeat. However, there was a change in the nights. It was delicate. A feeling that, despite the security cameras showing nothing, we weren't alone in the store. Occasionally, when I knew Ralph was outside smoking, I would hear footsteps in the storage room. At other occasions, even when nobody had entered, the motion chime at the entrance would ding. When I looked up, all I could see was the night breeze blowing through the automatic doors, which were wide open. The first several times Ralph said, "Old sensors, moths are attracted to these stupid things." Perhaps he was correct. However, at 3 in the morning, you're standing in an almost empty store. Your brain begins to notice things it shouldn't when it's surrounded by flashing lights and the quiet hum of refrigerators. Ralph and I were sitting on milk crates behind the counter one night at around 2:30 in the morning, drinking coffee and observing the passing of time. "Ever see anything weird out here?" I responded. Ralph grunted. "You mean besides people buying burritos that expired 2 months ago?" "I mean really weird," I replied. His cigarette burned low between his fingers as he gazed at me for a long time. "You heard about the accident out back, right?" "What mishap?" "About 10 years ago, a truck struck the ditch behind the lot. Propane-filled tanker. Before the fire department arrived, the driver was burned alive." I winced. "Is that accurate?" Ralph gave a damn nod. "Jimmy Holler was his name. Used to frequently deliver here. Nice man, too. They claim he dozed off while driving. He peered out the window at the dimly lit rear lot. People occasionally report seeing headlights outside in the middle of the night. Same time, same route, as if he's still working on his final delivery." I chuckled, anxiously. "It sounds like one of those ghost stories about truckers." He didn't chuckle. "I've seen him." 3 nights later, it took place. I was filling in for Ralph because he had called in sick. It was a Friday, and the fog outside was dense enough to engulf the hole in the streetlights. The store phone rang around 1:15 a.m. Nobody ever contacts the store at that late hour. "Martin Carter's Fuel." For a moment, I introduced myself as Alex. "Nothing." Then a voice rasped, full of static. "You must go outside." I froze. "Who is this?" The slight hiss of static, but no response. Next, click. I stared at the receiver as I carefully hung up. My gut twisted in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on, but the logical half of me insisted it was a joke. I made my way to the back door, which opened into the gravel lot and dumpster. When I opened it, the motion light flickered on. Everything seemed muted, and the fog outside was as thick as milk. The light above me buzzed softly, but that was the only sound. Then I noticed it. 2 spotlights were aimed directly at me just beyond the lot's border, where the road vanished into the mist. They appeared to have been parked with the motor off, since they were glowing rather than moving. The lights faded out after maybe 10 seconds of staring, not switched off, but disappeared. I locked the door behind me. When Ralph arrived, I informed him what had happened when I returned the following evening. He didn't blink at all. "Man, I told you. Every few weeks, he travels the same route, visits this place every time. You're suggesting that I'm telling you to quit picking up the phone after midnight." He grinned as he said it, but there was no humor in it, more akin to a caution. I wanted to think it was a coincidence, a fool trick. However, something else occurred that evening. I heard a conversation at the front counter at around 3 in the morning when I was replenishing the beer cooler. Ralph sounded low and mumbly, but the counter was vacant when I went outside. "Ralph, I made a call. No answer." He wasn't there either when I went outdoors. He had left, but his truck was still parked near the ice maker. With a flashlight in hand, I walked around the aisles and called his name once more. Nothing. The entire building seemed to be holding its breath because of the dense air. The store phone rang once more after that. With my heart pounding, I grabbed it up. Ralph's speech was calm and deliberate, followed by static. He went outside. I have no idea why I stepped outside once more. Perhaps because I didn't want to accept that it was true. That night, the fog was even more dense. It was hardly penetrated by my flashlight. I headed for the dumpster along the gravel walk. "Nothing," I yelled at Ralph. Then I noticed new footsteps that led to the ditch behind the property, pressed deep into the gravel. I noticed something sparkling in the muck as I followed them. Ralph's keychain, the small metal truck charm he carried with him at all times. My chest constricted. I noticed a dim floating orbs ahead of me in the fog when I extended the light. Headlights flickered once, then again, and this time they began to slowly and carefully approach me. There was only light slicing through fog, no crunch of gravel, no sound of an engine. I bolted. I didn't stop until I was inside, shutting and slamming the back door. I was hardly able to dial 911 because my hands were shaking so much. The lot was deserted, with no lights, no fog, and no Ralph when the sheriff showed there 30 minutes later. They spent days looking. Ralph may have gone off or fallen into the river behind the hill. According to the sheriff, he was never located. For a week, Linda shut down the radio. She offered me day shifts when she reopened, but I declined. Instead, I gave up. I informed her that I was returning to Chicago. In actuality, though, I was having trouble sleeping. I saw those lights in the mist each time I closed my eyes. 2 months later, at 2 in the morning, I received a call from an unidentified number. The first sound I heard when I picked up was static, followed by a broken, feeble voice saying, "Pump 4 is empty. You must go outside." I learned that Carter's Fuel and Market had burned down a few months after I left Brookhaven. They said it was an electrical fire. This is the portion that made my blood run cold. Although nobody was harmed, near the backlot, where the old propane tanker had crashed all those years ago, there was an unexplained ignition, according to the fire report. Additionally, the file states that the fire personnel discovered new wheel tracks coming in from the road when they arrived. Just tracks, no car. I no longer work at night. It doesn't matter how much it pays or how quiet the work is, because when the world goes to sleep, the lights buzz overhead, and you feel as though someone is watching you from just beyond the edge of the darkness. Sometimes they are, and sometimes they're still traveling that last lonely road, headlights slicing through the mist in search of a conversation partner, or someone who will turn on the lights.